Welcome back to the Perspicacious Perspective. In this episode, we dive into the history of Cuba. Cuba is famous for its rich cultural heritage, music, vintage cars, and tropical landscapes. The island nation has carved out a distinct identity that blends Spanish colonial roots, African influences, revolutionary politics, and Caribbean charm, making it a unique and recognizable presence on the world stage. You might wonder, however, why Cuba has a tense political relationship with the US, whether it still has a communist regime running the country, and whether it is safe for foreigners to travel to. This episode will tell you all about that and explain why Cuba is the way it is today. By the end of this episode, hopefully you'll feel more reassured about whether you should include Cuba in your travel plans, at least in the near future. So is Cuba still a communist country? Yes. Cuba is still officially a communist country as of 2025. The Communist Party of Cuba, or the PCC, remains the only legal political party and holds a constitutionally guaranteed leadership role in both government and society. Although there have been some economic reforms in recent years, such as allowing limited private enterprise and some foreign investment, the economy remains largely state-controlled, especially in key sectors like healthcare, education, and energy. Cuba continues to operate as a one-party system with no legal opposition parties, and political dissent is tightly restricted. The current president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, also serves as the first secretary of the Communist Party, having succeeded Raul Castro in both roles. Despite the introduction of a few market-style elements, Cuba's political and economic structure remains firmly rooted in communist ideology. How long has Cuba been a communist country? Cuba has been a communist country for over 60 years, with its political transformation beginning shortly after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Following the overthrow of US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, Fidel Castro rose to power and gradually steered the country towards a Marxist-Leninist model. Although Castro did not immediately declare the government communist, by 1961 he publicly identified Cuba as a socialist state and aligned closely with the Soviet Union, both politically and economically. This alignment deepened over the next few years, and in 1965, the Communist Party of Cuba was formally established as the ruling political organization. From that point forward, Cuba solidified its identity as a one-party communist state, a system that remains in place today. What happened during the Cuban Revolution in 1959? The Cuban Revolution in 1959 was a pivotal moment in the island's history, resulting in the overthrow of the authoritarian regime of Fulgencio Batista and the rise to power of Fidel Castro and his revolutionary movement. The revolution was the culmination of years of political unrest, economic inequality, and widespread dissatisfaction with Batista's corrupt, US-backed dictatorship. Fidel Castro, along with his brother Raul Castro, Ernesto Che Guevara, and other rebels, led the 26th of July movement, a guerrilla campaign that began in the mountains of eastern Cuba in 1956. After years of fighting and gradually gaining support among peasants and segments of the urban population, the revolutionary forces advanced westward across the island. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country as the rebels entered Havana, the capital, marking the official success of the revolution. In the immediate aftermath, Fidel Castro and his allies began to consolidate power. The new government undertook radical reforms, including nationalizing land and industry, redistributing wealth, and eventually aligning politically with the Soviet Union. These actions set the stage for the establishment of a socialist state and the decades-long tension with the United States, which included events such as the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. How corrupt was Fulgencio Batista? Fulgencio Batista's regime in Cuba was widely regarded as deeply corrupt, particularly during his second period in power from 1952 to 1959, when he ruled as a military dictator. His government was marked by widespread bribery, embezzlement, political repression, and close ties to organized crime and foreign business interests, especially American corporations and mafia-run enterprises in Havana. Under Batista, wealth and power were concentrated among the elite, while poverty and inequality worsened for much of the population, especially in rural areas. Government officials often enriched themselves through kickbacks and shady business deals. Batista himself reportedly amassed a vast personal fortune through through skimming government funds and profiting from US gambling and hotel interests that flourished in Havana. In addition to financial corruption, his regime was notorious for brutal repression. Political opponents, union leaders, and student activists were frequently imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Freedom of the press and civil liberties were virtually non-existent, and the state security apparatus operated with impunity. Although Batista initially came to power in the 1940s as a populist with some reformist policies, by the time of his 1952 coup, he had abandoned any democratic pretense and turned Cuba into a police state heavily influenced by US business and criminal syndicates. This climate of corruption and oppression was a major catalyst for the Cuban Revolution. How did Fidel Castro rise to power? Fidel Castro rose to power through a combination of armed rebellion, political strategy, and popular support, culminating in the overthrow of the Batista regime in January 1959. His path to leadership began in the early 1950s when he became increasingly vocal against the corruption and repression of Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in a 1952 military coup. Castro first attempted to challenge Batista through legal means, running for Congress in 1952, but the elections were cancelled after the coup. In response, he turned to armed resistance. In 1953, he led a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, a bold but ill-fated effort that resulted in many deaths and his own imprisonment. During his trial, Castro delivered his famous defense speech known as "History Will Absolve Me," in which he outlined his political vision for Cuba. He was sentenced to 15 years but released in a general amnesty in 1955. After his release, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he regrouped and formed the 26th of July movement with his brother Raul Castro and Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. In late 1956, they returned to Cuba aboard a small boat called the Granma, launching a guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Over the next 2 years, they gained momentum by building support among rural peasants, organizing sabotage in urban areas, and capitalizing on growing public anger at Batista's corruption and brutality. By late 1958, Castro's forces had grown significantly and Batista's control was weakening. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country and Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana shortly afterward. Castro quickly assumed power, first as a key figure in the provisional government and later as prime minister, eventually consolidating control and transforming Cuba into a one-party socialist state under the leadership of the Communist Party of Cuba. What was Fidel Castro like as the leader of Cuba? As the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro was a highly polarizing and complex figure, revered by some as a revolutionary hero who stood up to imperialism and uplifted the poor, and reviled by others as an authoritarian ruler who suppressed freedom and led Cuba into decades of economic hardship and isolation. Castro ruled Cuba with absolute authority from 1959 until he formally stepped down in 2008. Early in his tenure, he quickly centralized power, eliminated political opposition, banned independent media, and established a one-party state led by the Communist Party of Cuba. Political dissent was not tolerated, and critics were often imprisoned, exiled, or executed, especially in the early years. Elections were controlled and lacked meaningful opposition. He saw himself as a champion of anti-colonialism and socialism, famously opposing US influence in Latin America and aligning with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Under his leadership, Cuba played a prominent international role, sending troops and aid to socialist movements in Africa and Latin America. He became a symbol of resistance to US dominance, especially in the global South. Castro's government made significant investments in social services, especially in healthcare and education. Cuba achieved one of the highest literacy rates in the world and developed a robust healthcare system that provided free care to all citizens. Life expectancy and infant mortality rates improved significantly, often rivaling those of wealthier countries. On the other hand, Castro's economic policies, such as mass nationalization of industries, central planning, and collectivization, led to chronic inefficiencies, food shortages, and a lack of consumer goods. Cuba's economy became highly dependent on Soviet aid, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the island plunged into a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. Though limited market reforms were later introduced, economic hardship persisted. Castro was known for his fiery oratory, personal charisma, and tireless work ethic. He gave marathon speeches that could last hours and was deeply involved in all aspects of governance. However, this personalism also led to a cult of personality and stifled institutional development. Most major decisions depended on him, and there was little room for dissent or power sharing. In short, Fidel Castro was a leader who left a lasting and controversial legacy. He brought free healthcare and education to Cuba and gave it a unique global identity, but at the cost of political freedom, economic opportunity, and individual rights. What was the Bay of Pigs invasion? The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed military operation launched in April 1961 by Cuban exiles who were trained, funded, and supported by the United States government, specifically the CIA, in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba. After Castro came to power in 1959 and aligned with the Soviet Union, the US viewed his regime as a serious threat in the Western Hemisphere, especially amid Cold War tensions. In response, President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized a secret plan to train and arm Cuban exiles for a counter-revolution. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he inherited the plan and reluctantly approved the operation, although he scaled back US military support to preserve plausible deniability. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. The plan was to spark an uprising among the Cuban people and quickly topple Castro. However, things went wrong almost immediately. The invading force encountered strong resistance from Cuban armed forces, and the anticipated local support never materialized. Castro's forces quickly overwhelmed the invaders, and within 3 days, most of the exiles were killed or captured. The Bay of Pigs was a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration and a significant propaganda victory for Castro, who used it to strengthen his grip on power and further align with the Soviet Union. It also deepened tensions between the US and Cuba, eventually leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 between the United States and the Soviet Union over the deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. It is widely regarded as the closest the world ever came to nuclear war during the Cold War. The crisis was rooted in the growing tensions between the US and Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion and US efforts to destabilize Fidel Castro's government. In response to these pressures, Castro sought military and economic support from the Soviet Union. In 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, partly in retaliation for US missiles placed in Turkey near Soviet territory. The Soviets believed that these missiles would strengthen Cuba's defenses and provide leverage against the US. The crisis began on October 14, 1962, when a US U-2 spy plane discovered Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy was immediately informed, and after consulting his advisors, he decided to pursue a diplomatic route rather than a military strike. On October 22nd, Kennedy publicly announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles. This announcement set the stage for intense diplomatic and military tension. For the next 2 weeks, the world held its breath as the US and the Soviet Union came to the brink of war. American forces were placed on high alert and the threat of nuclear conflict loomed large. Behind the scenes, both sides engaged in secret negotiations, with Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanging tense but ultimately constructive messages. The crisis was resolved on October 28, 1962, when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public US pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove US missiles from Turkey. Both sides claimed victory, Kennedy for securing the removal of the missiles, and Khrushchev for ensuring that the US would not attack Cuba. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis was significant. It led to the creation of a direct communication hotline between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings, and it encouraged both superpowers to adopt more cautious approaches in their Cold War engagements. While the crisis solidified Castro's position in Cuba, it also strained relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba, as Castro had not been consulted in the deal to remove the missiles. What happened in Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991? When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba was thrown into an economic crisis known as the Special Period in Time of Peace. For much of the Cold War, Cuba had relied heavily on the Soviet Union for financial support, trade, and military assistance. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of this relationship and left Cuba facing severe economic challenges. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's economy was heavily subsidized by Moscow. The Soviet Union provided Cuba with cheap oil, food, and other essential goods, and in return, Cuba exported sugar, tobacco, and other products to the Soviets. Additionally, the Soviets supplied Cuba with military aid, which helped sustain Fidel Castro's government in the face of both internal dissent and external pressures. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, Cuba lost its primary trading partner and financial benefactor, creating an immediate and dramatic economic crisis. The country's GDP contracted sharply, and Cuba faced severe shortages of food, medicine, and essential goods. The energy crisis became particularly acute as Cuba lost access to Soviet oil, leading to power outages, disruptions in transportation, and the collapse of many industries that depended on energy supplies. The economic hardship led the Cuban government to declare a special period in 1991. This period was characterized by widespread austerity measures with rationing of food and basic goods. The government attempted to adapt by increasing domestic food production, encouraging self-sufficiency, and calling for a return to a simpler, more resourceful living. The black market flourished, and Cubans were forced to get creative with how they found food, medicine, and other necessities. The agriculture sector was hit hard, as Cuba had relied heavily on Soviet imports of food and agricultural machinery. The country faced severe food shortages, which led to the introduction of urban gardens and efforts to promote organic farming, though these were often insufficient to meet the needs of the population. Public transportation also suffered, as many buses and trains were powered by oil from the Soviet Union. The special period brought tremendous social strain. The Cuban people faced widespread hunger, malnutrition, and poverty, and the country's once vaunted healthcare system was strained due to shortages of medical supplies. There were also migratory pressures, as many Cubans attempted to flee the island in search of better opportunities, with some attempting dangerous boat journeys to the US. Despite these hardships, Fidel Castro's government resisted calls for political reforms and maintained its commitment to socialism. In the early 1990s, the Cuban government began to shift its focus towards a more mixed economy, allowing for limited tourism, foreign investment, and the creation of joint ventures with foreign companies. This shift led to some economic recovery, though Cuba's economy remained heavily controlled by the state. To mitigate the economic collapse, Cuba also sought to strengthen ties with other countries outside the Soviet sphere, such as Canada, Mexico, and Spain, as well as with Venezuela in later years. These countries began to provide Cuba with some degree of economic support, although it was never on the scale of Soviet assistance. One of the major consequences of the Soviet collapse was Cuba's gradual turn towards economic liberalization in the 1990s, albeit within the context of maintaining the one-party socialist system. Castro allowed more foreign investment, especially in the tourism sector, and remittances or payments from Cubans living abroad became a critical source of income for the country. While there were attempts to boost agriculture and food production through organic farming and local markets, the impact of the collapse was felt deeply for many years. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked a dramatic shift in Cuba's international relations and economic model. Although the special period led to difficult years, Cuba's eventual recovery, aided by a shift towards more pragmatic reforms, allowed the country to survive despite the loss of Soviet support. However, Cuba remained under a tight economic embargo imposed by the United States, which compounded the difficulties of the post-Soviet era. Cuba's response to the crisis also laid the groundwork for the economic reforms that took place under Raul Castro in the late 2000s, such as allowing more private enterprise and loosening restrictions on self-employment. These reforms, however, were always carefully managed to ensure the state's control over the core of the economy and political life. How did Fidel Castro's tenure as Cuban leader end? Fidel Castro's tenure as Cuba's leader ended in 2008 after nearly 5 decades in power. His rule officially came to a close when he stepped down from the presidency due to health problems. In 2006, Castro underwent emergency surgery for intestinal surgery and temporarily handed over the leadership of Cuba to his younger brother, Raul Castro, who had long been his trusted deputy. At the time, Fidel was expected to make a full recovery, but his health continued to deteriorate, and by 2008, it became clear that he would no longer govern effectively. On February 19, 2008, Fidel announced in a public letter that he would not seek re-election as president of Cuba, effectively ending his active political role. His resignation was a significant moment in Cuban history, marking the official end of his rule. Raul Castro formally succeeded him as president on February 24, 2008, although he had been serving as acting president for some time. Fidel's departure did not mean the end of his influence though. He remained an important figure in Cuban politics and continued to offer advice and commentary on national issues, even though he was no longer the country's head of state. He stepped down from his role as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba in 2011, officially relinquishing the last of his power to Raul. While Raul Castro led Cuba through a period of gradual reforms and a shift towards opening up the economy, Fidel's legacy loomed large, and he remained a symbol of Cuban resistance, socialism, and anti-imperialism. Fidel Castro passed away on November the 25th, 2016, at the age of 90, after living several years in relative obscurity following his resignation. What was Raul Castro like as Cuban leader, and how long did he last? Raul Castro served as the president of Cuba from 2008 to 2018 and as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba from 2011 to 2021. While he was less charismatic than his brother Fidel, Raul was known for being a more pragmatic and methodical leader, focusing on gradual reforms and political stability. His leadership style was shaped by his military background, having served as Cuba's defense minister for many years. Raul was seen as less ideologically rigid than Fidel, willing to make practical changes aimed at modernizing Cuba's economy while preserving the core principles of the Cuban Revolution. One of the key features of Raul's rule was his incremental economic reforms. He allowed for more private enterprise, including self-employment, and introduced some limited foreign investment. For the first time in decades, Cubans were permitted to buy and sell homes and cars, marking a significant shift in the country's economic landscape. Raul also allowed for greater access to technology, such as cell phones and internet access, although the government continued to tightly control information. In terms of foreign policy, Raul took a more diplomatic approach compared to his brother. Notably, his leadership saw the restoration of US-Cuba diplomatic relations in 2014, when President Barack Obama and Raul agreed to end decades of hostility. This marked a significant shift in Cuba's international relations, although these efforts were later rolled back by the Trump administration. Raul's leadership also focused on preparing Cuba for a post-Castro era. His decision to gradually hand over power to a younger generation was evident when he officially stepped down as president in 2018, passing leadership to Miguel Díaz-Canel. Raul remained in control of the Communist Party until 2021, finalizing the leadership transition away from the Castro family. While Raul's reforms had some positive effects on the economy, they did not fully resolve Cuba's challenges, such as the ongoing US embargo, food shortages, and limited political freedoms. Raul's time in power was largely seen as a transitional period that preserved Cuba's socialist system while preparing the country for a future beyond the Castro era. Who has succeeded Raul Castro, and what has this new leader done for Cuba? Miguel Díaz-Canel succeeded Raul Castro as president of Cuba in 2018, marking the first time in nearly 6 decades that someone from outside the Castro family assumed the country's top leadership. Miguel Díaz-Canel had been groomed for leadership for years, serving as Raul's vice president and as the first secretary of the Communist Party from 2011 onward. His rise to power was part of a broader leadership transition away from the Castro brothers, although he has largely continued their policies. Upon taking office, Miguel Díaz-Canel faced the challenge of managing an economy already burdened by the US embargo, declining support from Venezuela, and the slow pace of economic reform that had marked his predecessor's rule. He continued some of the economic reforms that began under Raul, focusing on private enterprise, foreign investment, and a more flexible economic model. Miguel Díaz-Canel emphasized the need to update Cuba's economy, allowing for greater private sector participation in areas like tourism, agriculture, and retail. However, his reforms have been cautious, with the government maintaining tight control over the core sectors of the economy. One significant development during his presidency was the monetary reform of 2021, which unified Cuba's dual currency system by merging the Cuban peso and the convertible peso into a single currency. While this reform was intended to simplify the economy, it faced challenges like inflation and economic instability, leaving the Cuban population grappling with rising prices and shortages. In terms of political and social reforms, Díaz-Canel's leadership has been marked by some gradual changes. In 2019, a new Cuban constitution was approved, recognizing private property and marriage equality for the first time. However, the constitution also reaffirmed the Communist Party's central role in Cuban society and politics, ensuring the continuation of the one-party system. Díaz-Canel has taken a more publicly conciliatory approach than his predecessors, acknowledging the need for dialogue with the people while also continuing to crack down on opposition movements and public dissent. One of the most significant challenges of his presidency came in July 2021, when widespread protests broke out across Cuba in response to food shortages, economic hardship, and frustration with the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The protests represented the largest outpouring of public dissatisfaction with the Cuban government in decades. Díaz-Canel responded by organizing pro-government supporters and deploying security forces to suppress the protests. While he acknowledged the economic difficulties facing the country, he remained committed to Cuba's socialist system and blamed the US embargo for much of the country's problems. Díaz-Canel's foreign policy has largely followed the traditional Cuban alignment with countries like Venezuela, Russia, and China. He has also worked to strengthen relations with Latin America and the European Union, while continuing to manage Cuba's complex relationship with the United States. Under his leadership, Cuba has navigated the shifting political climate in the US, especially as the Trump administration rolled back much of the diplomatic progress made during the Obama years. While Díaz-Canel's leadership represents a shift away from the Castro family, his presidency is still in its early stages. He faces significant challenges, including the ongoing economic crisis, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and demands for more political and social freedoms. As he steers Cuba into a post-Castro era, it remains to be seen how he will balance reform with the desire to preserve the one-party system and the principles of Cuban socialism. His leadership is marked by cautious change, but the future of Cuba under Díaz-Canel will likely depend on how effectively he navigates both internal and external pressures. What controversial things has Miguel Díaz-Canel been held accountable for since succeeding Raul Castro? Miguel Díaz-Canel has been at the center of several controversial issues, particularly surrounding human rights, economic hardship, and government repression in Cuba. While he has maintained the continuity of the Cuban socialist system, his tenure has drawn domestic and international criticism, especially for the government's response to public dissent and its handling of economic crises. The most controversial event under Díaz-Canel's leadership occurred during the nationwide protests in July 2021, when thousands of Cubans took to the streets to demand better living conditions, greater freedoms, and an end to government oppression. Protesters cited food and medicine shortages, long power outages, and the government's poor handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. In response, Díaz-Canel made a nationally televised address urging revolutionary supporters to confront demonstrators and move widely interpreted as a call for violence. The regime responded with harsh crackdowns, including mass arrests, internet blackouts, and detention of protesters, journalists, and activists. Human rights groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the government's actions, labelling them repressive and authoritarian. Following the protests, Cuban courts handed down lengthy prison sentences, some exceeding 20 years, to many of the demonstrators, including minors. These sentences were heavily criticised as politically motivated and intended to deter further dissent. The trials were largely closed door, lacked transparency, and often denied defendants the right to adequate legal representation. Díaz-Canel's government was held responsible for these crackdowns, which further tarnished Cuba's international image. During and after the protest, Díaz-Canel's administration cut internet access across the island to prevent the spread of protest footage and to disrupt communication among dissidents. This act of digital censorship drew condemnation from foreign governments, human rights organizations, and tech companies. It highlighted the regime's continued commitment to controlling information flow, even as Cuba cautiously expanded internet access in the years prior. Díaz-Canel has also been criticized for poor economic decision-making, particularly in relation to the currency unification reform in 2021, which ended Cuba's dual currency system. While the reform was intended to simplify the economy, it led to spiraling inflation, price hikes, and deepened the hardship for ordinary Cubans. Coupled with declining tourism revenue and the effects of the pandemic, these policies contributed to severe shortages of basic goods, which have persisted for years. Many Cubans blame the government, and by extension, Díaz-Canel, for failing to implement meaningful reforms to stimulate production or investment. Another flashpoint has been the government's treatment of independent artists, journalists, and intellectuals. The San Isidro movement, a group of artists and activists protesting state censorship and demanding greater freedom of expression, gained international attention in 2020. The Cuban government responded with harassment, surveillance, and arrests, which again drew global criticism. Miguel Díaz-Canel's refusal to engage with these groups and his administration's continued use of repressive tactics reinforced the perception of Cuba as intolerant of dissent. Although Miguel Díaz-Canel presided over the passage of a new Cuban constitution in 2019, which recognized private property and same-sex marriage, it also reaffirmed the Communist Party's absolute authority and limited political pluralism. This mix of progressive and authoritarian elements has been criticized as cosmetic reform meant to modernize Cuba's image while maintaining the status quo. Critics argue that Díaz-Canel has not pursued meaningful democratization, despite positioning himself as a more modern and tech-savvy leader. In summary, Miguel Díaz-Canel's tenure has been marked by controversial crackdowns on dissent, harsh repression of protesters, economic instability, and ongoing limitations on free expression. While he presents himself as a reform-minded leader, many critics view his leadership as a continuation of Cuba's authoritarian governance, now enforced without the revolutionary legitimacy of the Castro name. What's Cuba's relationship like with other hegemons in the world today? Cuba's relationship with the world's major hegemons, namely the United States, China, Russia, and the European Union, are shaped by a mix of ideological alignment, economic necessity, and geopolitical strategy. Since the end of the Cold War, and especially under Miguel Díaz-Canel's leadership, Cuba has had to carefully navigate a multipolar world, maintaining strategic ties with some global powers while enduring tensions with others. Cuba's relationship with the United States remains deeply strained, shaped by decades of economic sanctions, political antagonism, and a long-standing US embargo that dates back to the early 1960s. While President Barack Obama took steps to normalize relations, including reopening embassies, easing travel restrictions, and promoting economic engagement, those efforts were largely reversed under Donald Trump, who reinstated sanctions and labeled Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism. Under President Joe Biden, there was some expectation of a return to the Obama-era thaw. However, the crackdown on the 2021 protest hardened US policy once more, leading to new sanctions and strong condemnation of human rights abuses. As of now, diplomatic ties are minimal. Economic restrictions remain largely intact, and Cuba continues to blame US policy for many of its domestic economic problems. Cuba has steadily deepened its ties with China, which is now one of the island's largest trading partners and an important source of investment, technology, and medical supplies. While the relationship lacks the ideological intensity of Cuba's past alliance with the Soviet Union, it is based on mutual strategic interest. China views Cuba as a symbolic partner in the Western Hemisphere and a potential foothold close to US territory. In return, Cuba receives infrastructure investment, access to Chinese telecommunications, and support in areas like digital surveillance, public health, and energy. While China does not provide the level of economic aid once offered by the Soviet Union, it plays a crucial role in sustaining Cuba's economy, especially as it seeks alternatives to traditional Western markets. Russia remains a close ally of Cuba, reviving many aspects of the Cold War-era partnership that once bound the two nations. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has provided Cuba with economic assistance, military cooperation, and diplomatic backing. Moscow has sent oil shipments to alleviate energy shortages, supported Havana in international forums, and regularly criticizes US sanctions on Cuba. In recent years, there have been reports of increased intelligence cooperation and speculation about Russian interest in re-establishing military or electronic surveillance outposts in Cuba, which would be geopolitically significant given the island's proximity to the United States. The Cuba-Russian relationship serves as a strategic counterweight to US influence in the Western Hemisphere. The European Union maintains a pragmatic and generally cooperative relationship with Cuba. The European Union is Cuba's largest external investor and a key player in tourism, agriculture, and development aid. In 2016, the European Union and Cuba signed the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, which aimed to promote political engagement, economic modernization, and dialogue on human rights. However, Cuba's crackdown on protests and continued suppression of civil liberties have strained the relationship. While some European Union members, like Spain and France, prefer continued engagement, others have pushed for sanctions or tougher stances on human rights. Overall, the European Union's approach balances criticism of authoritarian practices with a desire to promote economic reform and cooperation through dialogue rather than isolation. Venezuela remains one of Cuba's closest allies, though that relationship has weakened due to Venezuela's own economic collapse. The two nations have long exchanged oil for Cuban doctors and advisors. Mexico has maintained friendly ties with Cuba and, under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has defended Cuba's sovereignty and called for an end to the US embargo. Canada is also a key economic partner and has historically supported constructive engagement rather than isolation, maintaining diplomatic and commercial ties even at times of US-Cuba tension. Cuba's foreign policy today is driven by strategic pragmatism. It maintains strong ties with China, Russia, and to a lesser extent, the European Union, while enduring a hostile relationship with the US. Miguel Díaz-Canel has continued the strategy of balancing between global powers to sustain the country economically and diplomatically while resisting demands for political liberalization. Is Cuba a safe place to travel for Americans and Westerners? Cuba is generally considered a safe destination for Americans and Western travelers, especially when it comes to violent crime, which is relatively rare compared to many other countries in the region. The Cuban government maintains a strong police presence, and crimes against foreigners are taken seriously, particularly in areas frequented by tourists such as Havana, Varadero, and Trinidad. Petty crimes like pickpocketing, scams, and overcharging can occur, especially in crowded or tourist-heavy areas, but they are typically non-violent and avoidable with standard precautions. Additionally, Cuba's healthcare system is quite robust, and emergency medical care is accessible for visitors, which contributes to the overall sense of safety. For US citizens, travel to Cuba is legal, but comes with specific restrictions. Americans cannot visit as traditional tourists, but must travel under one of the 12 approved categories authorized by the US government. The most common of these is support for the Cuban people, which requires travelers to structure their trip in a way that engages with the local population and supports private enterprise. This often means staying in private accommodations known as casas particulares, eating at family-run restaurants known as paladares, and avoiding transactions with government-run establishments that appear on the US State Department's restricted list. Travelers are expected to document their activities and maintain records of their itinerary and spending for up to 5 years. Cuba also requires all visitors to have travel insurance, and proof may be requested upon entry. Credit and debit cards issued by US banks do not function in Cuba, so Americans must bring sufficient cash for the entire trip, ideally in euros or Canadian dollars, to avoid the additional exchange tax on US dollars. While internet access has improved, it remains limited and government controlled. Wi-Fi is available in public hotspots and in some private homes, but speeds can be slow and access is not guaranteed everywhere. Though the country is politically stable, travelers should be mindful of Cuba's one-party communist system. Public criticism of the government is discouraged, and visitors are advised to avoid engaging in or commenting on political matters, especially in public. Surveillance is common in tourist areas, and some locals may be hesitant to speak freely with foreigners. Travelers should also be aware that infrastructure in Cuba, including roads and public utilities, is often outdated, and it's not unusual to encounter power outages or water shortages, particularly outside major cities. Basic goods such as toiletries and over-the-counter medicines can be hard to find, so it's advisable to bring necessary supplies with you. Despite these logistical and regulatory considerations, Cuba remains a rewarding travel destination with a vibrant culture, rich history, and warm, welcoming people. By planning ahead, following US travel guidelines, and staying respectful of local laws and customs, Americans and Western visitors can enjoy a safe and enriching experience in Cuba. Thanks for listening. If you found this episode insightful and engaging, please subscribe for more content like this. Until the next episode.